In Ether 1526, the Mormon scriptures claim that they were large and mighty men as to the strength of men. The 16th century chronicler Fernando de Alva Cortez Ixtacatl wrote, "In this land called New Spain there were giants, as demonstrated by their bones, and have been discovered in many areas." The ancient Toltec record keepers referred to the giants as Quinametsin, and as they had record of the history of Quinametsim, they learned that they had many wars and dissensions among themselves in this land that is now called New Spain. They were destroyed, and their civilization came to an end as a result of great calamities and as punishment from the heavens for graves, sins that they were committed. Allen and Allen. From the evidence, it seems irrefutable that a real race of red-haired giants dominated the Americas at one time, perhaps tens of thousands of years before the arrival of the ancestors of today's Native Americans across the Bering Strait, some 13,000 to 15,000 years ago. In defense of this statement, one must concede that the race is a mutable thing. Defense of this statement, one must concede that race is a mutual thing, and that the physical appearance of New World humans during the Ice Age may have been quite different. Perhaps they were part of a line that left no known descendants. By the same token, the presence of a forgotten Caucasian population in Asia that would have walked across Beringia with other Asiatics is also a possibility. This would explain some of the unusual results from recent genetic testing, which has confirmed the presence of Caucasoid genes in some of the existing ancient remains. Western Europe, explorers such as Ferdinand Magellan, Sir Francis Drake, Hernando de Soto, and Commodore Byron, the famous poet Lord Byron's grandfather, all reported encountering living giants all across the North American continent, remnants of a once proud and noble race of Caucasian superhumans. Later, I think I got a little bit of that too. Later in Chapter 6, we will explore more accounts of giants in the New World. But first, let's examine what they have been one of their early roles in the history of the human race. We will then attempt to define a viable scientific explanation for the genesis of giants. Where did the giants come from? And if not the stars, did they evolve on Earth? And if so, how? We will examine both topics in the following chapter. The early role of giants and other catalysts for their genesis. Giants, builders of ancient civilizations. In the earliest accounts, which are most prevalent in the Greek and Near Eastern tradition, giants of prehistory are often depicted as great builders and engineers of all the structures left to us by the ancients. Perhaps the most enduring are those that are universally known as megalithic monuments. These great archaeological achievements are compelling, not only because of their immense size, but also because of the ambiguity concerning their origins. Who built them? When? Why? And equally important, how? In European folklore, giants were often credited with creating these massive stone monoliths. Indeed, there is more direct mythological connection between giants of the prehistoric construction of these megalithic structures and the eventual doom of a lost civilization. In this chapter, we will explore the open-ended question of the early role of giants may have played, before moving on to examine a potential scientific cause for gigantism. We may come up with some very surprising answers. Accounts of giants as skilled engineers. In the book of Numbers, Moses sent a pre-invasion reconnaissance into the Promised Land to gather intelligence about the Canaanite enemy. The scouts reached as far as Hebron, where they found, much to their surprise and horror, that the descendants of Anak were still inhabiting the region. Pioneering biblical archaeologist G. Ernest Wright addresses this issue of giants in ancient Canaan in his 1938 article, Troglodytes and Giants in Palestine. In it he writes, Pausanias, a 2nd century CE Greek geographer, tells us that the great walls of Mycene, Tiryns, and Argos were constructed by giant cyclops. Hebrews, viewing some of the cities of Canaan, which we now know have possessed walls as thick as 18 feet and often built of Cyclopean masonry, might well have thought in terms of giants just as did the Greeks. Biblical expert Ronald S. Hindell corroborates this view in the March-April 2009 edition Biblical Archaeology Review, in which he writes that when the Israelites were confronted with the vast Cyclopean walls of the old ruined Canaanite cities, they inevitably concluded that the indigenous population of Canaan did in fact consist primarily of giants. This conclusion, says Hindell, is born out of many biblical texts. When the spies returned to their equally horrified commander and prophet, Moses, they reported, "The people who live in the land are powerful, and their fortified cities are very large. And indeed, we saw giants there. All the people that we saw in it are men of great height. We seemed in our own eyes like grasshoppers, and so we seemed in their eyes." For the most, that should be Velikovsky, or the original text. They got someone named Hindell credited here for that. I've read that before. For the most part, in its naturally easier place to ancient reports in a modern context, and assume that the original writers simply were confused and didn't know what they were talking about. That seems unlikely. However, because these cultures were highly sophisticated, although they were not as advanced as the culture of Atlantis, they were probably more or less on a par with our own culture today. When they made conscientious descriptions of people, places, and events, they were not doing so as children. They were making intelligent and highly rational interpretations of what they were witnessing. So yes, it is highly likely that the people of Canaan were indeed giants, as described by these spies in the Old Testament. Hindell also mentions the Battle of Jericho, a racial cleansing of the Canaanites at the hands of the Israelites, wherein the city of Jericho was destroyed and hundreds of thousands of Canaanite men, women, and children were killed, as stated in Joshua 6:20. Joshua and his troops marched around the city once a day for 6 days. On the 7th day, they marched around it 7 times, and on the 7th circuit they blew their horns and shouted. When the people heard the sound of the horns, the people shouted a mighty shout, and the walls fell down. It was creations such as the walls of Jericho that best illustrate the building capability of the early giants. However, from this quotation, we see that even masonry allegedly built by them wasn't totally indefensible. The ancient historian Josephus confirms that these giants were indeed skilled architects. He mentions 2 pillars, one of stone and one of very hard brick, which the giants erected to stand as a lasting testament to their engineering skills. They were constructed so that at least one might survive the great deluge to come. The giants feared that this final catastrophe would destroy everything that had been built by their hands. In Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, Josephus wrote, "Now these pillars remain in the land of Syriad to this day. Noah quitted the land of Seth for fear that his family might be annihilated by the giants. As late as the days of Joshua, son of Nun, there were still giants of Hebron who had bodies so large and faces so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these giant men are still shown to this day. Did giants build the dolmens of Western Europe? Medieval Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus insisted that giants must have once existed, because only they, and their awesome strength and superhuman capabilities, could have built the dolmens, menhirs, massive walls, and other structures that are strewn across Western Europe. The idea of a vast megalithic culture that once dominated much of Europe in the same remote past is taken up by author Paul Dunbavin in his book Atlantis of the West. For Dunbavin, the megalithic structures of Europe are not just simple creations built by a Stone Age culture, but the sophisticated handiwork of an advanced and ancient race, possibly the Atlanteans. Indeed, Britain was once named Albion, after a Titan king of Atlantis. Dunbavin believes that Atlantis lies beneath the Irish Sea and was submerged in 3100 BCE when a comet struck the Earth. Well, you know that. That's what they have, impacts, causing the Earth's crust to shift and thus shrinking some of the existing land masses, including those in and around ancient Europe. Dunbavin, 2003. Armenian Stonehenge. The fallen temple of Baalbek, one of the most ancient and archaeological significant megalithic sites in the world, is Baalbek, where the bones of what may be ancient giants have been found. Baalbek lies approximately 86 kilometers northeast of the city of Beirut in eastern Lebanon. This most enigmatic of holy places is one of the Near East's most important Roman and pre-Roman temple sites of study by historians and archaeologists. In 1898, a German expedition there claimed to have discovered no evidence of occupation prior to the Roman period, despite other claims suggesting a very ancient habitation of the site. Recent archaeological finds have supported the latter idea, for in a deep trench at the edge of the Jupiter Temple platform, Neolithic artifacts were discovered, along with skeletons of 3 individuals of giant stature. Pottery dating to the Seleucid era, 323 to 64 BCE, as well as the Roman era remains, were also discovered. During both the Seleucid and Roman occupations, the town surrounding the immense religious monument was known as Heliopolis, city of the sun, and the sun god Jupiter was the focal point of the shrine. We have discussed this before. That's when Jupiter replaced Saturn for a brief period. The Roman god Jupiter had overtaken and supplanted the Greek god Zeus. They're both the same thing. Who replaced the earlier god Baal, well, that was Saturn, who identically shared some common characteristics with Zeus and subsequently Jupiter. Archaeologists now agree that Baalbek is more than 9,000 years old, with continual settlement dating from the Neolithic Age to the Roman Iron Age. Surrounding the site are massive walls built with 24 monoliths, weighing some 300 tons each. The tallest wall on the western flank of the temple site contains what is known as Trilithon, a row of 3 stones, each 19 meters long, 4.3 meters high, 3.6 meters broad, cut from solid limestone. Each stone weighs approximately 800 tons. Even with today's technology, moving them into place would be a tremendous archaeological accomplishment indeed. According to David Hatcher Childress, large numbers of pilgrims came from Mesopotamia as well as the Nile Valley to the temple of Baal el-Astarte. The site is mentioned in the Bible in the Book of Kings. There is a vast underground network of passages beneath the Acropolis. Their function is unknown, but they were possibly used to shelter pilgrims, probably at a later period. How then was Baalbek constructed? Ancient Arab writings explain that the first stages of Baalbek, including the trilithon and other massive stone blocks, were built following the Great Flood at a mandate of King Nimrod by tribe of giants. Again, we see the same giant motif lending credence to the race of giants theory. How could so many disparate cultures in so many isolated locations all around the world arrive at the same supposition giants were responsible for building the great megalithic monuments of prehistory? Well, Baalbek dwarfs anything built in Rome or Egypt. It does look like it was built for giants. Stonehenge, the Giant's Ring. Another significant megalithic site needs little introduction. We are referring, of course, to the glorious Stonehenge, perhaps the most famous megalithic structure in the world. One fascinating story concerning Stonehenge is a 12th century account written by Geoffrey of Monmouth. In his work, Hysteria Regum Britanniae, also known as the History of the Kings of Britain, Geoffrey maintained that the rocks of Stonehenge were healing rocks, and that had been imparted from Africa, and that they had immense curative properties. Collectively called the Giant's Dance, Stonehenge had, according to Geoffrey, originally been constructed on Mount Killorus in Ireland. 5th century author, Arthur-like figure, Ambrosius Aurelius, at the behest of Merlin, designed Stonehenge to be instead a monument for the knights who perished fighting off Saxon incursions. Thus, the king dispatched Merlin, Uther Pendragon, and 15,000 knights to Ireland to capture the monument and bring it back to Britain. The knights slew 7,000 Irish warriors, but were unable to move the rocks with ropes and brute force. End of chapter. Chapter 3. Accounts of giants in the classical sources. As we shall learn, according to the Greek myth, as conceived by such seminal authors as Hesiod and Homer, the primordial earth produced a series of primeval monsters and giants, human-like beings known as Titans, who became the first race of Greek gods. Other giants followed, including the Cyclops, Gigantes, Centaurs, and Typhons. In this chapter, we will explain ancient evidence of them, primarily from sources derived from the classical world, and explore how inhabitants of the classical world were on a very physical search to find evidence for themselves that these giants once roamed the earth, a land of gods and monsters. The ancient Greek writers called their country a land of gods and monsters, referring to the often pernicious Greek deities and their hundreds of various giants, monsters, demigods, and other creatures that inhabited it. These giants, however, such as the Cyclops, Antaeus, and Orion, were surprisingly human-like, and they were not altogether disproportioned to human beings, for they mingled in love and strife with them. Bulfinch, 2004. But those other giants who waged war against the gods and exhibited superhuman, even godlike powers were far more gigantic in size than their weaker brethren. Examples of these gigantic giants include Tityus, who was said to have been so large that while resting on the plain near Mount Olympus, his massive body covered some 9 acres. Now, that's a giant. Enceladus, too, required the whole of Mount Etna, upon which to rest his enormous head. Where is it? Still others, like Boreas, had 100 arms. Typhon, the sea beast, excreted fire from his abominable lungs. Bulfinch explains that, according to the Romans, at one time they put the gods to such fear that they fled into Egypt and hid themselves under various forms. Jupiter took the form of a ram, whence he was afterwards worshipped as the god Ammon, who with carved horns. Venus, a fish. Mercury, a bird. At another time the giants attempted to climb up into heaven, and for that purpose took up the mountain Ossa and piled it on Pelion. They were at last subdued by thunderbolts, which Minerva invented and taught Vulcan and his Cyclops to make for Jupiter. The Greek religious writer Hesiod describes the giants vividly. They were warriors of immense strength and power who donned gleaming white armor and brandished long spears and other deadly weapons. Treated with poison, these depictions of the giants as cruel combatants adept at the art of war conform to later portrayals in ancient Greek and Roman art. The idea of a revolt against the gods, however, did not emerge until the 6th century BCE, with the first artistic depictions of the conflict. While the poet Hesiod often makes clear that the giants were highly warlike and violent creatures, there was no evidence of those tendencies being directed at the Olympians until a much later time. I'm going to have to look that up, see if I can find some pictures for it. The war. Backing up the myths with science and excavating giant bones in antiquity. Having touched on a few mythological accounts of the giants, let's now turn for a brief moment to the field of archaeology, where we will see the physical evidence may or may not support the mythological accounts, while bearing in mind that the results of any study regarding the examination of ancient giants purported to be those of ancient giants must be met with caution, but also with an open and prepared mind. Too frequently we are duped by archaeological hoaxes, but an equal amount of discoveries are inexplicable, and in this remain fascinating in their open-ended implications. The finding that you will read about next, called The First Fossil Hunters, written by historian and folklorist Adrian Mayer, are some brief examples of the latter. Skeptics claim that what the ancients really found were bones of long-extinct mammals and dinosaurs, such as the mammoth or triceratops. Wherever the truth may lie, for mainstream scholars the choice is simple. Either ancient peoples mistook prehistoric remains of dinosaurs or extinct mammals to be those of the giants and heroes described in their ancient myths, such as the Nephilim, as described in the Bible, or the Greeks' very own Titans and Cyclops, or they downright imagined that they were the remains of giants because they wanted to believe this was so. In any event, the compelling nature of these unearthed bones caused a great bone rush amongst the people of the city-states of ancient Greece and later among the larger territories of the Roman Empire. They were already searching for relics to make money. We will have more to say on this bone rush a bit later in the chapter. But for now, let's look at more of the classical accounts that mention giants before we explore how the concept of giants fits within the cosmology of our classical forebears. The planets were closer. Homer's giants. The ancient Greeks possessed a mythology rich in symbolism about giants. In 400 BCE, the Greek poet Homer wrote, "On the earth there once were giants." To the ancient Greeks, Homer was much more than one of their most highly revered writers. In their view, his two principal works, the Iliad and Odyssey, were divinely inspired. Together they formed the Bible of the entire ancient Greek civilization. Well, the story of Iliad is the story of the close encounters with Venus and Mars and the moon, and Jupiter was there too. With regard to giants in the Iliad, a scenario mentioned briefly by Homer in this work involves the twin giants Otis and Phyledes, known collectively as the Eleukadi. They were renowned for their strength and bravery. However, they were equally disdained for their audacity and recklessness. Otis and Phyledes brought much chaos upon the gods. They tried to storm the home of the gods by piling 3 Greek mountains on top of one another: Olympus, Ossa, and Pelion. Ares, god of war, that's Mars, attempted to halt their advance, but instead the giants put Ares in chains and held him captive for 13 months. Hermes eventually rescued Ares, but it was the goddess Artemis, Venus, who finally brought about the twin giants, that's just my guess, destruction. She metamorphosized into a deer and jumped in front of them. They raised their bows and took aim, each firing a shot, but ultimately they missed the deer and hit each other instead, whereupon both were killed. In the Odyssey, we are introduced to the mighty Cyclops, a fierce race of one-eyed giants. When Odysseus and his fellow Archaeans became trapped in a cave inhabited by one of the Cyclops named Polyphemus, who immediately began to devour one of the captives, the air became filled with heavy-laden stench as the god gulped down their limbs and torsos in outpourings of blood. The horrifying clamor of agonizing shrieks and in the crunching of bones drowned out the sound of ocean surf and seagulls on the beach. In response, Odysseus's men prayed to Zeus for salvation, but to no avail. The bloodthirsty giant then murdered 2 more men. When Polyphemus left in the morning, he placed an immense rock behind him, blocking the exit from the cave. This prevented the Achaeans from following him out to the fields and to safety. Unable to escape and return to the ship, Odysseus planned a ruse. When the giant returned, Odysseus offered his captor wine, intoxicating him in the morning. As the Cyclops slept, the men gouged out his single eye with a pole. Dirty bird. The giant immediately awoke, screaming in agony, calling out for the other Cyclops to help. However, they simply ignored him. Polyphemus removed the rock, blocking the entrance to the cave as he searched blindly for his assailants, and then the Archaeans made their escape. After escaping the island of the mighty Cyclops, why would he leave them access to a spear? The mighty Cyclops, the Achaeans, were caught in a tempest and blown off course. They rode to a land of, Laestrygonians, a powerful race of giants. Their giant king, Antiphades, and his queen captured and dined on Odysseus's men, who beat a hasty retreat back to their boats as the towering giants hurled immense boulders at them. All of them but Odysseus were destroyed. Then Odysseus escaped to the home of the gods, Circe, which he remained for some time. Today it is uncertain whether a man named Homer really existed, or the name merely represents a number of separate authors, their individual identities now lost to the sands of time. Despite such speculation, one thing is certain: Homer has proven to be much more than the creator of fairy tales. In his greatest epic, the Iliad, the Greeks were pitted against the inhabitants of Troy. This was proven to be a very real, very ancient city by Hendrik Schliemann in the 19th century, as we shall read about later in this book. The giant Orion, ancient brute or traveler to the stars. In Pliny the Elder's immortal work, Natural History, he cites Greek and Roman mythology with regard to the ancient legend. The giant Orion, Pliny explains, was born from the skin of an ox, which had been placed by a humble peasant into the soil of Boeotia. At the insistence of the Atlantean gods, Neptune, Mercury, and Jupiter, the Atlantean demigods relieved themselves upon the pile, thereby spawning the giant. Orion is featured at the feet of a bull among the constellations, the bull being the most sacred object of worship among the Atlanteans and their ancient temples. Orion is not a hideous ogre. However, he is described as very handsome, and he is also said to be a superb and mighty hunter. Orion's main love interest was Merope, the daughter of Opinion, king of Chios, and he desired to marry her. He purged the island of all beasts and wild creatures, and the spoils of the hunt were given to her as presents in an attempt to win her over. Oenopion, however, refused to grant permission for Orion to marry his daughter. Angered by this, Orion attempted to rape Merope. This infuriated her father. He made Orion drunk, then robbed him of his vision and guided him to the seashore and left him there. Wandering Hero, now blind, followed the sound of a Cyclops' hammer until he finally arrived at Lemnos and came to the forge of Hephaestus, who, taking pity on him, entrusted him with one of his men, a guide named Kedlion, who took him to the abode of the sun. Orion placed Kedlion on his shoulder and proceeded east, where he met the sun god Helios, who restored his vision with a beam of solar rays. After this, Orion became the lover of a fellow hunter, Artemis. He was her favorite, and she often boasted that one day she would marry the handsome giant. Her brother, Apollo, was highly indignant about the affair. But it didn't deter Orion and his beloved Artemis. One day, as Artemis was out hunting with her bow and arrow, Orion submerged into the sea, with just the top of his head sticking out of the water. Apollo and Artemis happened upon the scene. Apollo knew what they saw in the water was the head of Orion, but Artemis did not. When Apollo suggested to Artemis that she try to hit the object with an arrow, she complied. She was then horrified to find the dead body of Orion washing up on the shore. Artemis placed him among the stars, where we can still see him today, appearing as a giant with a girdle, sword, lion skin, and club. He is followed by his dog, Sirius, and before him fly the Pleiades, who were nymph companions of Artemis. The shoulder blade of Pelops. This fascinating story involves the Greeks during the siege of Troy, circa 1200 BCE. According to the author of a classical scholar, Adrian Mayer, the battle between the ancient Greeks and the inhabitants of Troy continued unabated for more than a decade. 10 long years of bloodshed and misery, no end in sight. At this point, the battle-weary Greeks took a Trojan seer prisoner and forced him to reveal ancient secrets. The Greeks would never taste victory unless they located the shoulder blade of the great hero Pelops and brought it to Troy as a talisman. The Greeks then dispatched a vessel to Olympia to find and bring back Pelops's gigantic shoulder blade to the battlefront. Mayer takes reference to Pausanias, a Greek traveler and geographer of the 2nd century CE, or AD, who lived in the times of Emperors Hadrian, Antoninus, Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Mayer says that according to the Pausanias, some bones of heroic size were discovered by the Greeks who were searching for the shoulder blade of Pelops, and they assumed that they were his. These Cyclopean relics believed to possess potent magic and were supernatural powers, were found housed in a bronze chest and stored within the temple of Artemis at Olympia. Mayer points out the first fossil hunters that, according to Pausanias, as a youth Pelops had been chopped up and served to the gods as a blood sacrifice. But once the gods realized on whom they dined, they restored the young Pelops to life. His shoulder bone, however, had already been eaten, so they gave the young hero a new shoulder blade made of ivory. But it was this new shoulder blade that was housed with the rest of Pelops's bones in the temple of Artemis. Pausanias claims that the ivory shoulder bone was actually shipped to Troy during the prolonged war, and Mayer corroborates that account. According to her, it was bundled in straw for its journey by mule from the Olympia to Selene on the coast. There it was loaded onto a boat bound for Troy, either lashed to the deck with ropes or placed below the ballast. After a long sea voyage of nearly a week, Pelops's shoulder bone arrived at Troy. I never heard this story before. What about the horse? And just as the seer had predicted, the relic bone witnessed to the sacking of the city and the triumph of the Greek forces. Following their much-anticipated victory, the Greeks loaded the ancient artifact back onto the ship and departed for Greece. However, the Greek vessel was met with a violent sea storm and was wrecked off the coast of Euboea. Their precious cargo was lost forever. Euboea. Dead heroes and giants from Greek and Roman mythology. Across the narrow Dardanelles from Troy, Mayer writes, the ancient Thracian Chersonese, the Gallipoli Peninsula, was the setting of a unique dialogue. The work she refers to on Heroes, written about 218 CE AD by the sophist Philostratus of Lemnos. Some of these names, I swear. What is otherwise considered an early romance novel is also peppered with references to the discovery of cyclopean bones and enormous relics belonging to long-dead heroes and giants from Greek and Roman mythology. The setting for the dialogue is the port of Ilias, at the mouth of the Hellespont. The opening act, a rustic grape farmer turned philosopher and a merchant awaiting his trading vessel, engaged with intriguing conversations. The grape farmer tells the merchant he has heard rumors of gigantic bones being found, remains that supposedly belong to the giants and Greek heroes. He also claims to be well versed in the stories of men who had become the Greeks' heroes during the Trojan War, such as Achilles and Ajax. The merchant then inquires about whether there is any empirical proof to support the belief in heroes who average some 10.5 cubits in height, 4.5 meters. That's quite tall. The farmer replies by listing some of the main heroes of Greek mythology whose bones had been supposedly found during the prior centuries, including Orestes' 7-cubit skeleton seized by the Spartans from Tegea, Plato's account of a huge skeleton found by a shepherd in the aftermath of a massive earthquake in Lydia, and the unearthing of a giant Erides at the banks of the Orontes. The farmer's own grandfather, Mayer explains, had told him how Roman Emperor Hadrian came to pay homage to Ajax's relics after the skeleton, with memorably big kneecaps, was washed out by the sea just across the strait. Hebeion embraced and kissed the bones and laid them out, apparently in a configuration of a man, about 15 feet tall. Then the emperor built a fine tomb for Ajax's bones in Troy. Have you personally seen any hero's bones? Asked the merchant. The farmer responded, less than 50 years ago, I myself sailed across the Strait of Sigeum to view the last skeleton that eroded out of a rocky cave on the Cape. Signium, near Rhodium, was a Greek hero Achilles' traditional burying place. The upper body of the skeleton was concealed in a cave, but the rest of the bones extended some 10 meters onto the Cape. And that is where we will stop. That's about concept of giant impact, the Greek thinking, the theory of evolution, and the concept of extinction in the ancient world. Reading the subchapters. The bone rush, the quest for the hero's remains. Did ancient archaeologists know what they were finding? Orestes and his sacred remains, gigantomachy, and giant fossil discoveries. Giants could also be monsters. And Hercules in the body of Antaeus. Those are some of the subchapters. A world of snow monsters and frost giants. That would probably be a good. Clash of the Gods. I'll read a little of this, and then we'll be done. Clash of the Gods, the Norse deities and the giants. From a realm of cold and darkness came the frost giants, threatening to plunge the mortal world into a new ice age. But humanity could not face this threat alone. Or by ice giants, they mean Neptune and Uranus. Our armies drove the frost giants back to the heart of their own world. The cost was great. In the end, their king fell, and the source of their power was taken from them. With the last great war ended, we withdrew from the other worlds and returned home to the realm eternal, Asgard. And here we remain as the beacon of hope, shining out across the stars. And though we have fallen into man's myths and legends, it was Asgard, as its warriors, that brought peace to the universe. Odin, the All-Father Thor. It says Odin, the All-Father Thor, 2011 film. A world of snow monsters and frost giants. The early beliefs of Northern Europe encompass a rich and sinister mythological tradition that includes not only giants, but an entire host of magical and mystical creatures. The ancient Norse divided the peoples of the world into 3 distinct categories: civilized people, barbarians, such as the Nordic peoples themselves, and subhumans, which, as the Skraelings of native peoples of North America, when the Vikings entered the region for the first time, they took their swords and battle axes in hand and tested them out on anyone they encountered to determine whether they could be killed and thus were human, or whether they were invincible, which meant they were giants or members of one of the other many magical races, therefore immortal. Examples of the magical races include orcs, trolls, elves, half-gods, and of course, giants. All of these were very similar to the creatures that the famous author J.R.R. Tolkien wrote about in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. In attempting to understand the Norse mythology, we need to understand its origins. According to the 19th and early 20th century writer Donald Mackenzie, Celtic and Teutonic Norse mythology demonstrate a definite commonality. It would appear, he writes. The archaic giant lore is pre-Celtic and pre-Teutonic, therefore implies a common inheritance in the wars of the Olympians and Titans. And the Irish Danann gods are Formorics, and the Azir and the Jotuns.